Hi, I'm Dr. Carrie Hennessy, and I'm the multi-tiered system of support leader for the district. I'm responsible for academic, behavior, and mental health supports for students and staff. We want everyone to feel at their best, and we know that safety is a key part of the equation. We continue to look for ways to support staff in this area. Being able to de-escalate a situation and keep yourself and those around you is vital, whether you're working with students or adults. I am honored to be able to introduce two of my colleagues today, Aaron Conan, one of our excellent special education coordinators, and Matt Kessner, one of our excellent high school counselors, who are going to walk you through this training today. We hope you will find this training useful and worthwhile. Matt and Aaron, take it away.
Hello, I'm Matt Kessner. I'm a school counselor at Fairmont.
And I'm Aaron Conan, and I am a special education coordinator at some of our elementary schools.
Today we're going to talk to you about the de-escalation strategies that you can use in your classroom, and that'll help you maintain some order with our students or give you some more tools to maintain order in your classroom, as well as keep you and your children safe. So we're going to go through some general introductions to these topics, and then we're also going to cover 10 tips that'll really help you with de-escalation strategies for your students.
The first thing just to kind of touch on is we want to just remember that behavior is a language. So we're looking at what is that behavior communicating, not just the behavior in itself. And if we kind of keep that in mind this whole time, I think that will be really helpful, and especially in remembering some of the tools and when to use which tool.
Something else to remember is that a lot of our students come with a lot of mental health challenges. A lot of our students have mental health diagnoses, and some of them don't. According to the National Institute of Public Health, about 25% of 13 to 18-year-olds are diagnosed with anxiety disorders. That's just one mental health disorder that our children are faced with. And when they come into our classroom and they're facing these challenges, their behavior could be a reflection of that mental health disorder.
So let's kind of dive into this and answer the question of what is de-escalation? What do we mean? We're going to probably say that term a lot during this. So I think it would be good to talk about that first and what we're meaning when we say that phrase of de-escalation. So de-escalation, when we're saying this, we're talking about us attempting to reduce an escalating emotional swing and then redirecting students to a point of emotional control. Or we might think about it as helping to reduce an emotional swing so that person can remain rational. Rational is another word that you will probably hear throughout this presentation. And to do this, we're going to use varying degrees of intervention, mostly verbal. When we say physical intervention, it would mostly be body language things. This is all hands off what we're talking about today.
Another point to make there is this is not a you will get the student in control. You are helping them come down in their emotional swing. So we're de-escalating that behavior. We're not ending the behavior. So to keep that in mind, we will still have kids with outbursts and we will still have kids upset. We're just working on bringing them down to a point where they can start to gain some rational control of themselves.
Okay, so one of the first things we want to talk about is something that we call, and CPI calls, the integrated experience. And really all that means is that behavior influences behavior. So I feel like we've all been there where we're coming in and it's like, yes, it's going to be a great day, and then all of a sudden one kid does one thing and it could ruin our mindset, at least for the next little bit. And then we might be unintentionally influencing our students' behavior without even realizing it. But so it's a two-way street. How they're acting and reacting to us influences us, and hopefully we can react in a way that's going to influence their behavior to de-escalate, like Matt was talking about before. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through some of these tips, that how we respond is going to influence, hopefully, how they are then responding to help regain some rational thought.
Yeah, I love the behavior influences behavior. That's a great point. Great way to remember that. The next thing we're going to discuss is rational detachment. This is a phrase again from CPI. Rational detachment just means you're able to separate yourself from this situation. You're able to recognize that the student who is having an outburst, or the parent or the adult who is upset, doesn't necessarily mean they're mad at you. You're able to step back from that situation and kind of look at it from a non-emotional state and come up with a solution.
I think sometimes this is easier said than done. So just keep in mind that it's okay, and we'll talk about some of those strategies of how to help you rationally detach, especially to some of those higher risk or more frequent situations that you might come across.
Absolutely. These are all tools for the toolbox.
That's right.
So the final thing we're going to talk on before we get into the actual CPI's 10 tips for de-escalation is precipitating factors. So this just means there's a lot of stuff going on that we're unaware of. There's a lot of things that go on in our students' lives, in our colleagues' lives, in our own lives that's private and that's personal and that doesn't get out very much. Something that could be really simple to explain it, like with our students, could just be a bad day on the bus. So coming into school, you're on the bus, and the kid's just not having a great morning, and they show up to your classroom in a really bad mood, all because of the bus ride. Nothing against the bus, but sometimes at 6:30 in the morning, the bus is just not where anyone wants to be. So precipitating factors are really just things that occur that we have no control over. So it could be as simple as having to ride the bus, but it could also be significant, like food insecurity or abuse, or things that we would be heartbroken to find out about, but that really do happen every single day, unfortunately. And knowing that there are these precipitating factors help us to then show a lot more grace for our students, because knowing that, man, they didn't have food since Friday, or they had this fight with their family, knowing that stuff's going on can certainly make us a lot more compassionate with these kids. I know you already are incredibly compassionate. I've seen a lot of you guys do amazing things, but recognizing these precipitating factors can just help us to be even more compassionate with them.
I really like the next visual, if you're taking a look at that iceberg of what we see versus what might actually be going on. But also, if you notice things kind of below the surface, some of them are positive. And that's kind of another underlying theme is how can we help create some of those things, like they feel safe, they feel like they're trusted, or they have a voice. All of that can kind of impact that integrated experience again, and hopefully then allow them to maybe share some of those precipitating factors if they so want to, so that we're then able to help them appropriately.
So the 10 tips for de-escalation strategies, the first one is to be empathic and non-judgmental. So if you can just think of yourself having a conversation with some friends, and a colleague or someone in your life walks in and scoffs at whatever you're saying, being very judgy, you're going to automatically have a bad feeling about that person. And so consider our students when they're in an emotional state, and when they're losing rational thought, when their emotions and behaviors are rising to the point where they're not in control. If they feel like they're being judged, and if they feel like they're not being taken seriously, they're not going to calm down very quickly. That's not going to help them. So being empathic and non-judgmental can really help de-escalate that student's behavior. That doesn't mean you have to agree with what they're doing. It just means that you're listening to what they're doing, what they're saying. You're not judging them as they're going through this little mini crisis. And by doing so, you can really help kind of take the wind out of their sails. A bad phrase to use when we're talking about being empathic, and it would be, well, at least you're not fill in the blank. So if a kid comes to you and they're really upset that they're not picked to play on the basketball team or whatever, and you tell them, well, at least you got to play basketball, or at least you got to do something, well, that doesn't really hit home with the kid. That does not tell the kid that you're listening to what they're really saying. Yes, you're recognizing that they they still got to play, but what they're really saying is they're hurt that they weren't chosen. They're hurt that their friends decided to pick somebody else. And so being able to recognize that and just taking that phrase, well, at least you're not XYZ, out of your vocabulary, then you're going to really save yourself a lot of headache, because the kids will recognize you are listening to them.
Next one, our next tip is to respect personal space. So this, something I like to point out here is this isn't always just about your bubble, it's also about their bubble, and sometimes there's kind of a back and forth. Sometimes my bubble is a little bit bigger than maybe the students would like it to be, but also that this could sometimes include their stuff or their items, or if we have students who utilize a wheelchair or a walker or crutches, that is part of their person also. And sometimes if we might just be trying to be helpful to them, we are invading their personal space, which is not really, communicating that respect to them. And especially when somebody is already kind of moving up that escalation and losing that rational thought, to have somebody or more than one somebody kind of get in close might make that anxiety go up or the frustration. So we want to be really aware of what that personal space looks like. And we'll go into some of the other things that might come with that we're communicating non-verbally. But just remember that sometimes when we're upset, we don't want people close to us. So we need to remember that and respect that for our students as well, which I know that especially right now, we are probably all very aware of. But keeping that in mind, especially during those moments of escalation, as we're trying to help them return to that rational thought process, that we might have an intention to be helpful and moving in closer, but to them, that's just an invasion of their personal space and might be putting them a little bit more on the defensive.
Tip number 3, use non-threatening nonverbals. I think this is really especially important for our younger students because we are all a lot bigger than our elementary kids, mostly. And just the fact that we are an adult can come across as a threatening conversation or a threatening presence, especially if our students have gone through some significant traumas. Just the presence of an adult could be scary to those little guys. So using non-threatening nonverbals really comes down to your body language and what you're communicating with your body. And knowing that your sheer presence could be intimidating, considering your body language could really help offset and take away some of that potential threat there. And so I'm 6 foot tall. I don't think I'm a massive individual, but I'm definitely bigger than a lot of our freshmen. And as a freshman counselor, I'm interacting with them a lot. And I think I have to really think about how I'm positioning my body when I'm coming into classrooms to talk to students, or when they come to my office. I have to make sure that I'm presenting myself in a way that's not very threatening. So I'm considering where my body is positioned in the room or in the hallway. I'm considering how I'm positioned. So an example I like to give is I used to go around and talk to students about their grades. I like to go into the hallways and find kids and pull them out of class and talk to them that way, because it felt a little less formal than having them come to my office. Well, what I started doing was going around and talking to students, but I would pull them in the hallway and I would stay standing in the middle of the hallway as they put their back towards the lockers. And really quickly, I realized they did not appreciate that setup. They were very uncomfortable by the conversation. Their backs were against the wall, literally, and I was asking them tough questions about why their grades were the way they were and what was going on. So a few weeks of that, I realized I was very unproductive, and then so I decided to flip the roles. I was applying what I learned through CPI and considering how my body posture was with the students. And so I flipped and I put my back against the wall and I let the kids stand in the hallway. And that gave them the flexibility to kind of move around in the hallway and kind of get some steam off blow off some steam. And by doing that, I was able to get to the root of a lot of their issues with their poor grades. And the majority of the time, there was something way more significant than just not turning in homework. So by positioning myself in a way that was non-threatening and using nonverbal cues, I was able to then get a lot more information about how to help these kids when they were really, when some red flags were going up. They weren't at a point where they're fully escalated, but their grades were suffering and there were some cues that we should do something here. So consider how your body is positioned, how you're presenting yourself, the tone you're using, all that stuff. The nonverbals can really make a big difference.
As someone who is not 6 foot tall, I'm only about 5 feet tall, I can say that even if someone is walking up to me and having a conversation, the second that I have to lift my chin to be able to maintain eye contact, it feels a little bit more threatening to me. So especially keeping that in mind for our students who, even if they're just sitting down as we're approaching them, how that might come off, especially if they've already started to lose that rational thought process a little bit. Tip number 4 is avoid overreacting. Sometimes in the moment, this can be really tough. We're hoping that by sharing some of these tools with you, this might become a little easier, especially in some of those really escalated scenarios. It's really easy sometimes to just make a blanket statement and then regret it later. And we're going to talk about some setting limits and that kind of follow through here in a little bit. But I think those kind of go hand in hand in terms of don't say something unless you mean it and you can actually follow through on it. So I will use myself as an example. When I was in the classroom, it was a pretty escalated situation. I probably was starting to need to tap out with somebody maybe to help that interaction. But instead I said, if you touch that computer, you lose technology for a month. Well, touching a computer, losing technology for a month, maybe not. You know, I don't really know that punishment matched the crime there. So just kind of making sure that we're putting those follow through steps in place, but that we're not overreacting and that there is kind of that natural consequence piece that goes along with it so that we can hopefully avoid, you know, the repetition of that behavior in the future.
Tip number 5 is focus on the feelings. So a lot of times our kids will be really upset and they might be saying things that are just nasty and hurtful, but you can see that they're crying, or you can see that they're looking left to right, very anxious, very nervous, and that what you should be looking at is the feelings, not listening to the mean, nasty, defensive words that they're shooting out. And the reason for that is those feelings are directly tied to what's going on in that kid's brain. So they might just be saying things or doing something to cause a distraction, to get you off topic, to get their feelings covered up by something else. So if you can really just step back, kind of how we talked about with that rational detachment, if you can just step back just a little bit and see the big picture and really look at what feelings are being demonstrated by that student who's acting out or beginning to get escalated, you can start to see some kind of the underlying messages that's there going on. And this can really make a big impact on that kid, because some of our kids who have shared, like in surveys and talking with teachers and counselors, that sometimes they just don't feel safe. And when the kids aren't feeling safe in the building, that fear of not being safe can make them act in ways that just doesn't make any sense to us. So if we can step back and say, okay, they're throwing a fit, but the reality is they're scared or they're anxious and nervous, we can really help encourage that kid to get control of their emotions, at the same time addressing their fears.
I think another important thing, especially for some of our younger students, is they might not fully understand or be able to name the emotion that they're feeling, and that can also contribute to some of those escalating factors, is not being able to process that. So even helping them to identify it and say, I see this, that makes me think you might feel this way, and being able to validate that for them and put a name to it can also kind of help, again, in that integrated experience, and then helping them kind of return to that rational thought.
Great point.
Tip number 6 is ignoring challenging questions. I'm sure that we can all think of at least 1 or 2 examples of a challenging question that we have received, maybe even already today. But what we're thinking about here, especially if we're just focusing on that de-escalation and that integrative experience, is we don't want to engage in a power struggle. That is going to keep the escalation going. We're kind of giving and taking with that control, and in some cases the student might feel totally in control because the power struggle is what they wanted. So it can be really hard sometimes, but ignoring those challenging questions. So you can and maybe will just straight up ignore them, or you might just be redirecting them back to the topic of, we're working on this assignment right now. Well, who's gonna make me? Well, this is what we're doing right now. Let me know if you want some help, instead of responding to that question of, I'm trying to challenge your authority. You can't make me do this. I will say sometimes I will just tell them that they're right. I can't force them to do it, but you can either finish it now or finish it later, those types of things. So it's, again, not engaging in that challenge or that power struggle with them to try to maintain a lower escalation and maintain that rational thought for both parties.
A tip that I use for ignoring challenging questions is just to change the subject. So I've had a lot of experiences with kids who are challenging. Typically when they come to the counselor's office, they're past the point of returning to the classroom. So they're over in my office. And I sometimes get the kids when they're still very escalated and they're still challenging the teacher, but by asking me the questions. But what I do is just completely change topic. And I can think of my last example of doing this. I discussed the difference between incandescent and halogen light bulbs that were in my office. I don't know what the differences are really. I know they're just different shapes. The kid was completely deflated. He's sitting there trying to egg me on and have me choose a side, and I ignored his questions. I ignored what he was saying at that point until he got back in control and I could start to dig down deeper into what those feelings were he was trying to hide. But by ignoring him completely, just not adding fuel to the fire.
Okay, we're gonna move into one of my favorite things to talk about, which is tip number 7, setting limits. There's 3 main factors when we think about limit setting. Again, you can find all of this on CPI's website. They talk a lot about limits as well. I believe they also have some resources on limit setting if you wanted to kind of dig in a little bit deeper to this. First and foremost, it should be simple and clear. I'm going to borrow your example. Matt always likes to say, if you can't say it in one breath, it's too complex because you're going to lose them. So you might use an if-then format, you might use when-then, or you might interrupt them. So I had an experience at a previous school district where we had a student who loved to interrupt, just to kind of gain that attention. And so we got into the habit, just kind of discussed it as a team, that we were going to interrupt the interruption and redirect before it could happen. So we kind of learned what it looked like before that student was going to interrupt, and before they had the chance, we would attempt to say, oh, thank you so much for waiting your turn and not interrupting. So reinforcing that rule, but kind of then still redirecting and keeping it positive. I did probably use a limit earlier in my overreacting example of, if you touch my computer, then you don't get technology for a month. That kind of goes into the next layer of limit setting, which is making sure it's reasonable. Probably not the most reasonable limit that has ever come out of my mouth. So making sure, again, that it's more of a natural consequence of, if you don't finish this now, then you will have it for homework, or then you will do it at recess, or with me during, your free period, whatever that might look like for your setting. So having that in there as well, making sure that it's, oh, well, you were 1 minute late, so now you owe me 4 days of detention, doesn't necessarily off the cuff seem like a reasonable limit. Now, I will never say never, but just making sure that it is a reasonable limit, and then making sure that you can enforce it. There's a lot of times where we might say something because we think it will just be an automatic. I will make sure that I will be calling your mom. Well, I wouldn't say that unless you were actually willing and going to call said parent. Just because you don't want to lose your credibility with them, because they'll be less likely to listen the next time, and then that trust element that we talked about earlier is lost as well because you didn't follow through or enforce your limit. And I will say it is tricky at first, but actually I have found that more that we're able to enforce those limits, usually the faster we're able to build that relationship and that trust, and then the kid knows that it's going to be a follow through, and sometimes that can help in itself in that escalation or de-escalation strategy that we're seeing. So just kind of make sure that it's simple, that it's reasonable, it matches what we're seeing happen, and that we are able to enforce it and show that follow through.
Tip number 8, choose wisely what you insist upon. We've kind of covered this point a few times already on previous de-escalation tips, but the point here is pretty self-explanatory. Don't really grab a point or an issue and hang on to it. Choose wisely what you insist upon. Some of our kids will be really pushing our buttons and trying to find their limits. And if we take every infraction that they make and just demand excellence, and demand that they follow exactly to a T our procedures, we're going to drive ourselves nuts. There are street laws, traffic laws, and I would bet a majority of the people listening to this have rolled through a stop sign, maybe gone a little bit faster than the speed limit. That happens. But if an officer was chasing us down and stopping every single person who went 26 miles an hour instead of 25, they'd be writing tickets all day long. So same concept applies here. Choose wisely what you insist upon. If it's a little bit of an infraction, you're going to be okay to let that slide or just point it out and then move on. So rather than demanding an apology, a correction, a complete reversal of that action. So just choose wisely. I see you guys do this all the time, so not a point we need to spend a lot of time on. And then tip number 9, actually tip number 9 and 10 are basically the same thing, so we're going to cover them together. Tip number 9 says allow silence for reflection. Tip number 10 says allow time for decisions. And both of these are they're so similar, so we're going to cover them together here. But our kids, when they're losing rational thinking, when their brains are in that downstairs brain, when they're just in survival mode, they're not thinking about higher level concepts. They're not thinking about what everything you're saying and how it's going to apply to their life. So when you are talking to a student who's starting to regain rational thinking, you're giving them some time for silence, you're giving them some time to reflect and to think about what they're going to do next. A lot of times our kids are only hearing bits and pieces of what we're saying, especially when they're escalated. They're only hearing little snippets. So giving them some time to think, time to process what you're saying and process what they're going to do can make a huge difference. I know I need some time when I make a mistake and I need to think through what I'm going to do. I don't always make an instant decision. A lot of times I need some time to think through what my next steps will be. And we should have the same mindset with our children, the students we're working with, the kids who they're learning how to make these decisions, and they're learning really how to navigate life. And if we're expecting them to have this high level of perfection, we're just going to frustrate ourselves. So allowing some time for reflection and some decision making will really help de-escalate those behaviors. Just like in your class, when you ask a question and no one answers, well, if you just give it enough time, someone's going to raise their hand and answer, just because people don't like silence. Same with our kids. When they're going through an emotional state, if you give them some time to reflect, they'll reflect.
I also think something that I have found to be very useful in this process when they are starting to regain at least some of that rational thought even just giving them that space in addition to the silence of when you're ready, and then giving them that location to go to, so they feel like they're able to stay where they are, and it can be anything that works for them. When you're ready, come see me over here, or when you're ready, give me a thumbs up, or put your head up if they have their head down at the end of maybe an emotional escalation. And so that way they're able to take that time, and they know that you're giving them that time, but that you haven't completely checked out on them. Again, back to that integrated experience of us allowing them to do that helps establish that trust, and them feeling safe and able to kind of take that time to process kind of what they were just experiencing.
Okay, so just a recap for our 10 tips for de-escalation strategies. Tip number 1, be empathic and non-judgmental. Tip number 2, respect personal space. Tip number 3, use non-threatening nonverbals. Tip number 4, avoid overreacting. Tip number 5, focus on feelings. Tip number 6, ignore the challenging questions. Tip number 7, set limits. Tip number 8, choose wisely what you insist upon. Tip number 9, allow silence for reflection. And tip number 10, allow time for decisions.
So again, we wanted to share these with you so that you have, it's just another tool in your toolbox, or really 10 more tools in your toolbox to kind of help in those situations that we know are coming, right? We know that we're all going to encounter at some point a situation that is escalating. So our goal is just to help provide support for that student or individual, and then again to keep them safe, but also keep yourself safe. So I know as we went through some of these tips, we talked about the students feeling safe, but the more that you're able to utilize these and the more comfortable you get, hopefully then that safety and that feeling of safety is for you as well, and other staff and students in your room. So every building in the district has people who are certified in CPI and as instructors. So if you're, really struggling to kind of process through a situation and you want some additional support, we are always willing to kind of come out and help brainstorm, or just listen, or be another set of eyes or ears on a situation, because we know that those come up, and sometimes you just need to talk it out and have another perspective on it. And maybe we can try some different strategies or utilize some of these in a different way. So I know I have myself done that when I've been in the classroom before, and it was very helpful. So never hesitate to reach out to any of us. That's why we're here. We all really believe in the program and have seen it be successful.
Thank you for taking your time to watch this whole PD. I hope it was helpful and insightful, lots of good information for you. Best of luck this school year.
Thank you.